Thanks very much. We're very happy to have our next speakers and to begin this session about technical considerations around manufacturing standards, regulatory needs, and capacity and role of clinical trials. And, I think we all recognize, and particularly in our efforts of the last few years of preparing for a pandemic, that obviously we have challenges in the United States in terms of our capacity and building capacity, and we also work very hard with David and other colleagues at WHO and throughout the world to try to better prepare. So I think we're much better off than we were a few years ago, but clearly one of the areas where there's much to do is in terms of having the regulatory capacity to go with the manufacturing capacity, the regulatory capacity to support development of new vaccine technologies and manufacturing sites, and I think the regulatory capacity throughout the world to assure that people can have confidence in the safety and quality of products, particularly complex biological products where we know that manufacturing quality is such a huge issue, both real, that we deal with every day in the United States and Europe and other very well-resourced areas, but also a high level of concern. And so with that, I think we're going to focus on talking a little bit about the present state of things, and David Wood, who's really been a leader in developing biologic standards and also working to bridge and support regulatory capacity around the world, will lead us off, and then Dr. Huong will provide perspective from, in a sense, both path and a country where they're trying to take advantage of the opportunity to build capacity and be able to respond better to a serious public health problem like a pandemic or just influenza in general. So we'll let David start. We'll go right to Dr. Huong, and then we'll have some discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Jesse, for those words of introduction. We've already had some questions about regulatory issues this morning, and as Christina mentioned, there are in fact 2 sessions on regulatory capacity in this meeting. Tomorrow we'll deal a little bit more in terms of global regulatory capacity and capacity building initiatives. What we'll try and do today in today's session is to set the scene by talking about some of the manufacturing standards, some of the regulatory needs, and the issues around clinical trials. And also, before I start, I'd just like to comment on some of the discussion that was going on around the vaccine safety issue just before lunch. And I would very much want to echo what Robin Robinson said, that we've got to let the data speak now, because the H1N1 vaccines are being used on a very large scale population basis, and some of the studies that are being done now to follow the vaccine safety are actually really intensive studies, and I think we're going to have a very good safety database of these vaccines, probably better than any other that we've had in the past. And I think that as those data become available, they need to be evaluated by independent experts, and the findings and conclusions from those evaluations need to be disseminated as widely as possible to counter some of the issues that we're all very much aware of. So what I'll try and do in this presentation is to talk about some of the manufacturing standards, the regulatory needs, and the capacity and role of clinical trials. So this is a slide that you've seen before. Mary-Paul put this up this morning to show the licensed monovalent pandemic vaccines that have been developed and are available. And I put this up just to illustrate the range of different types of influenza vaccines that we already have available to us. The first 3 columns are inactivated influenza vaccines, and the very right-hand column are the live attenuated vaccines. And then within each category of vaccine there are a range of different producers situated in different countries. And the reason for putting this slide up was to basically just to illustrate the complexity of trying to standardize this operation so that we can be confident that the vaccines that are being produced and are being used can be of an appropriate quality, safety and efficacy. And this is where the manufacturing standards are so important. And I think that, as we've heard this morning, that the influenza vaccines that we do have are based on actually a very long history of their development, production and use. And so I think we are actually in a relatively fortunate position in terms of manufacturing standards for influenza vaccines, that these are mature products and the manufacturing standards are in fact well standardized, and that this is also something that has been done and continues to be done on an international level. We have mechanisms that exist to put in place international expectations for manufacturing standards via WHO, and I'll explain on the next slide how we do that to achieve this standardization at the international level. And I just thought it was worth maybe just dwelling on one aspect of the standardization which is in place, which may not be evident to the audience today, and that is in terms of the way in which we express the potency of the influenza vaccines. Everybody, all of the manufacturers, all of the regulators around the world, all of the countries, express the potency of the vaccine in terms of micrograms of hemagglutinin. That's enabled all of the work that Mary-Paul showed you this morning in terms of the trying to get an assessment of the capacity of what's out there worldwide, really for us to do that, because everybody's speaking the same language in terms of how they calibrate the potency of their vaccines. That wasn't always the case. If you go back into the history of influenza vaccines 20 years ago, countries were expressing the potency of the vaccine in completely different ways, and therefore to have that conversation about what is global vaccine production capacity just wasn't possible. So this is one of the sort of the benefits of having had that standardization process in place and to have had that developed over the years. Have we solved all of the problems around manufacturing standards and international standardization? Certainly not. There are many issues that still need to be addressed, and Doug mentioned in his presentation the issue around the availability of reagents that are necessary to calibrate the current vaccines in terms of the hemagglutinin. We need a standard antigen, we need a standard antiserum, and the same problems that afflict the poor yields and the availability of the antigen for the vaccine, we have the same problems in terms of having preparations available to standardize the products as well. So there are many things that need to be done to improve the standardization of our vaccines, even though we're starting from a very good base. I must say one of the things that I've been very impressed in the response to the pandemic is the way in which some countries, and China notably, developed alternative potency methods to calibrate their clinical trial lots, so that they were able to use alternative methods that gained them around about a month in time to accelerate their clinical development plans. They had to go back and to make sure that the alternative methods were yielding results that were validated against the standards once the standards were available. But I think this is one of the other lessons learned, if you like, that we need to be working on ways to improve the availability of the reagents for standardization, and looking perhaps at alternative methods that are becoming more available to standardize the potency of the vaccines. So how do we go about this process of international biological standardization? This is one of the roles that WHO plays, and we have been doing this again for a very long period of time. We have a well-established process, and the standards that I just been alluding to in terms of manufacturing standards are established by what is called the Expert Committee on Biological Standardization, and these are published as the WHO Technical Report Series, and these form the basis for the global written standards, if you like, the international expectations of how you manufacture a vaccine to be of appropriate quality, safety and efficacy. In addition to those written standards, we also have an important program of work that develop physical standards, reference materials that enable the calibration of some of the assays that are used, the potency assays, both for the antigen and also for the antibody response to the vaccine. And that's an important component of the standardization work as well. And also the work that we do through WHO also helps to try to build global consensus around the actual process of standardization of the assays, the development and refinement of quality control tests, and also ensuring that the scientific basis for setting standards and the specifications that we use is there, because the standards have to be grounded in the science from the very outset. That's an absolutely key, important component. The reference, there's a web reference there to the standardization work that is done by WHO if you're interested. WHO itself is not a regulatory authority, so we provide these standards basically as a tool for the countries to use within their own national frameworks, whatever those frameworks may be. But typically the written standards, for example, that are established by WHO are then used by national pharmacopoeias, often without any change. They would just adapt them straight into their national pharmacopoeias and use them as the basis for the national legislation and control of products. These are also the technical specifications that are used in the WHO pre-qualification process that I'll come to at the end of the presentation. So once you have national level specifications, these can then be used by the regulatory authorities, the manufacturers, and provide information to the product users. So that's what I want to say in terms of manufacturing standards, and again sort of sketching in sort of a relatively high level information about the process and what we have in place. Moving on to what is needed to obtain regulatory approval of the vaccines. And again, looking at it from a global point of view, the categories of information that are needed by countries around the world to obtain regulatory approval of the vaccines are actually very similar when you look at it in detail. They all want, the regulatory authorities in different countries want data on the quality, safety and efficacy of the product. And as I say, the international expectations, if you like, for what a product needs to comply with are those WHO standards. When we look at influenza vaccines, we have quite a special situation in the fact that the influenza vaccines tend to change much more frequently than most other products. And what we see there is that the regulatory data requirements tend to vary with the level of pre-existing knowledge of the vaccine. So if we have a seasonal flu vaccine that's been produced using a particular process for a number of years, and you're essentially having a strain change to keep up with the change in epidemiology of the vaccine, then the data requirements for that new version of the vaccine are going to be less than if you have a brand new vaccine. Some of the types of vaccines that we're hearing about before lunch that have, the new products that are very exciting, which are coming down the pipeline, then you're going to need the full regulatory assessment first time around, at least to ensure that all issues have been considered. And again, I think that with the flu scenario, what we have seen is the development of very strong regulatory collaboration between the nations of the world, and partly this has been the fruits of the preparedness work that we started several years back to begin to think about what would be needed to regulate a pandemic flu vaccine, bringing together the regulators together to develop the documents that have been published and have formed the basis for the regulation of the H1N1 vaccine. But much more important, I think, in that it's begun to develop a sense of community amongst the key players. So as we've moved into the pandemic itself, there are always, as Mary-Paul says this morning, there's always unexpected things that you need to develop solutions for, in real time. And to have had a group that's met regularly and to be able to convene them to meet regularly by teleconferences, which we did, and we've basically run at one point weekly teleconferences with the regulators around the world, and the fact that they all knew each other, the flu groups knew each other very well, that's very much facilitated a very open, frank exchange of information amongst the regulators to solve problems as they come along in real time. And I think that is actually a great resource that we have now, this sort of regulatory community, if you like, specialising in flu. That's not there for any of the other vaccines or any other products, come to that matter, that we have. And I think something that we could try to nurture as we go forward to look, well, what are some of the things that longer lasting benefits from the pandemic that may come out that could benefit the seasonal flu vaccine production in the future, is that this resource that we have of this regulatory collaboration is something we could try to further nurture and develop. And then finally, what has been the role of clinical trials, or what should the role of clinical trials be as we evaluate the newer influenza vaccines? And again, there is a very common position from the regulatory authorities around the world that clinical trials are going to be needed for new vaccines, be these new products or be these new manufacturers of the recipients of the technology transfer. And I think, part of the rationale for that is that we're always learning something new about products or that we're dealing with, and influenza in particular is always giving us surprises. And I think that I think one of the important or surprises that we've had with the H1N1 pandemic vaccine that really the clinical trials have pointed out for us is the how highly immunogenic the vaccine has been after a single dose. The expectation going into the pandemic is that we were going to need 2 doses based on the experience we'd had with the H5, that a virus or a vaccine that is going into a naive population, you're going to need 2 doses to get a good immunogenic response. With H1N1, we've had that pretty much after 1 dose, and that's something that's come out of the clinical trials and the evaluation of the clinical trials data. So I think this is part of, one of the reasons why there is a need to do clinical trials, because you never really be fully sure what you're going to get when you go into the human population. And here again, I would emphasise the role for standards, going back to the standards that we talked about at the beginning of the talk, because I think here we still have work to do in terms of developing ways to compare the results, the outcomes of the clinical trials. Everybody's using either hemagglutination inhibition or microneutralization tests to do their assays, but is a titer in a microneutralization obtained in one lab the same as the titer obtained by a different lab doing a microneutralization test? And here I think there is something more that we can do in developing antibody standards that allow us to calibrate the tests all the clinical trials that are being done that would then facilitate better comparison of the results between different studies. And I'll show in the next slide an example of how that might be done. The last bullet just before leaving the clinical trials is that I think we also need to try to better understand the immune correlates of immunity, the correlates of immunity against influenza viruses. We all take it as read that a response against the hemagglutinin or a microneutralization is what is needed, but I think that maybe what the H1N1 is telling us, pandemic vaccine is telling us, is that there's a little bit more to it there that we're not fully understanding. Why has this virus been vaccine been so immunogenic? And I think a better understanding of immune correlates would be a benefit to everybody. Here's the example I wanted just to show you about the potential role of antibody standards for calibrating the clinical trials. We do have an antibody standard that was developed against the H5 clade 1, and the graphic shows the benefit of expressing results relative to that standard. So the top two panels show the results that have been obtained in an international collaborative study where we sent same samples around to a group of laboratories, asked them to run those samples in their usual tests and report the data back to us. And the top two panels just shows the raw data that's been reported back in both the HI assay and the micronewt assay, and there's a relatively big spread of the results. The bottom two panels show what happens if you just take that same data set but express those results relative to a standard which was tested in the same set of assays, and you can see that reduces the between laboratory variation quite considerably. So there's a similar candidate standard being evaluated right now as an H1N1 antibody standard. It'll be very interesting to see whether on that also produces a similar type of effect of reducing the between laboratory variation. We hope that it does so because that, I think, will enable us then to have a better way of comparison results. Very quickly, just at the end, to just talk about the WHO pre-qualification procedure, because that's been mentioned a time or two, and I think there are maybe a number of stakeholders in the room who may not be so familiar with the process. But basically, this is a process, a service provided by WHO that facilitates this access to vaccines of assured quality. For any one product, there is a global database of production of for a product. What the pre-qualification process does is provide filters to end up with a list of products that are of a particular assured qualities that have been defined by WHO. So then that list of products can be used by, for example, the procurement agencies, in this case UN agencies, UNICEF Supply Division and the PAHO Revolving Fund, and is also consulted by self-procuring agencies. So it's a way of identifying products which can be trusted to be of assured quality. And a very important filter in this process for the vaccines is the reliance on a functional national regulatory authority in the country of manufacture. In terms of the numbers of vaccines that are pre-qualified by WHO, this is the status as of the end of 2009. We have a bunch of manufacturers in the industrialized countries. Importantly, we have a number of manufacturers in emerging economies, and again, pertinent to the discussion this morning, Senegal is a country that produces pre-qualified vaccines, the yellow fever vaccine. And the vaccines that are pre-qualified by WHO are used to immunise around about 53% of the total population. So this is a well-established process and something that does facilitate access to vaccines of assured quality to a large population base. So in conclusion, I think influenza vaccines are mature products, and the manufacturing standards are well standardised up to and including the international level. I think regulatory needs are similar across the board from a scientific perspective for all countries. I think that global regulatory collaboration is certainly, we are doing it, and it is achievable, and it's something maybe that we can try to sustain for the future. Clinical trials are important and give us new information about products, even if we think we know a lot about them already. And finally, the pre-qualification scheme of WHO provides a mechanism for facilitating access to flu vaccines of assured quality. So with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, David, very much. I think what we'll do is have Dr. Huong talk about it from his perspective, and then we'll have discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to express my sincere thanks for the organizers, Department of Health and Human Service, to give me a chance to come here to share with you some of our past experience in working in Vietnam, focusing on the clinical trials, vaccine clinical trials. And also I would like to share some current status of clinical trial in Vietnam, and also the vaccine restoration procedures in Vietnam, to add on the knowledge of what's going on in the developing country. So we will give you an example in developing countries. So my presentation will follow first I will give you a very brief overview about past in Vietnam and past experience in clinical trial in Vietnam, and then followed by briefly giving you an overview of the current status of clinical trial regulations in Vietnam, just newly developed a couple of years ago, and then the current status of vaccine production in Vietnam. And I have some knowledge come from the vaccine companies in Vietnam, so they might add on if they think it's necessary. And the last, we would like to share some thought about the need of support based on our experience working in Vietnam, and also collect some ideas from our colleagues working in Vietnam to share with you. So just some information about past in Vietnam. We have worked in Vietnam since early 90s, early 80s. But till 1997, we just set up the project office since then. Before that, mainly we worked through the UN agency like WHO or United Nations Population Fund. And we work, at first stage, we work mainly on reproductive health, contraceptive introductions. And since we set up the projects, at first we only have 5 staff, and I'm lucky to be the first of past staff in Vietnam since 1997. And now we have office with almost 30 staffs, and more may be coming very soon with new projects coming. And since we start off, we work in more than 50 projects, but I would say mainly we focus on vaccine and immunizations areas. And we work with both government and private sector. And with government, we provide technical support for implementation of their health activities. We had some experiences in conducting clinical trials. Since we started very early in 1997, we worked with one of the national organizations, it's a National Institute for Hygiene and Epidemiology, to conduct the first clinical trial on hepatitis B vaccine. And that time, the hepatitis B vaccine locally produced is serum designed, not the recombinant vaccine. And at that time, we looked at the immunogenicity of the local produced vaccine. The second clinical trial we conducted in Vietnam is to look at the immunogenicity and the safety of local produced hepatitis B vaccine, what we did in the first clinical trial. And here we look at the immunogenicity of this vaccine to be kept out of cold chain. You know, in Vietnam, especially in the grassroots level, to be able to have the fridge in community center is really challenging, both in terms of financing and also the electricity problem. But now it's much better. And the third clinical trials we conducted in Vietnam related to the efficacy, safety, and immunogenicity of Rotatec. And we conducted also in partnership with or collaboration with the National Institute of Hygiene and Epidemiology. And the clinical trial just completed last year. And the fourth one, we just finished last week in the field activities, is immunogenicity and reactogenicity of the Gardasil, the HPV vaccine in Vietnam. So we're looking at the different schedules apart from the standard schedule recommended by the vaccine company. And we just finished the final bleeding just last week. And all of these clinical trials conducted in Vietnam, we worked with the National Institute of Hygiene and Epidemiology. Now I would like to share with you some information about the regulation on clinical trials. So before 2008, almost no regulation on clinical trial. Just very simple guidelines developed in 1975, but very simple and short one. And in 2007, the Minister of Health started looking at the regulation for clinical trials. So before that, all vaccines produced in Vietnam, so the clinical trial conducted by the vaccine company themselves, like a Biotech or IVAC, they produce vaccine, but also they conducted the clinical trial of their products. But now, since 1998, the MOH, Ministry of Health, just issued the regulation on clinical trials. And I talk a little bit more about what they defined in this regulation. So in this regulation, they define about the right and the responsibility of each stakeholders involved in a clinical trial. For example, sponsors, the vaccine company, the institute to conduct clinical trial, subjects involved in clinical trials. So they define the roles and the responsibility of each stakeholders. And they also mentioned about the approval process for clinical protocols. I will talk a little bit more later. But the clinical protocol should be reviewed by ethics committee. And regarding to the ethics committee, also it just established a couple of years ago. Before that, we also haven't got any committee to look at the ethical committee for studies. Before that, all the ethical and scientific issue reviews by what we call the science committee only. And in the regulation, they stated that the Minister of Health must respond within 60 working days after receive the complete protocols document. And if you submit not completed documents, you may need to wait for another 30 days or 6 months or 2 months. And they also provide some guidance for conducting clinical trials for PIs, for sponsors, for subjects, and they also have some annex to provide some guidance for the institution. When they submit the protocols, they should follow that kind of format. Here I just summarize some key points in that regulations. First, the ethics committee must review the protocol, and they also have a responsibility to supervise and monitor during the implementation as well. And they also define that only national institutes to be allowed for conducting clinical trial. So province level, we have a district level health authority, they are not allowed to conduct a clinical trial at this moment. And we need to submit protocol based on the format provided. So we can submit in English or in Vietnamese. And they will respond within 60 days, whether we are approved to conduct or not. And before that, nothing should be happened in terms of field activities. And for the new vaccines, there are 2 steps to be reviewed. So first, the vaccine company needs to submit the vaccine or documents related to the vaccines for approval first, to be able to conduct the to use that vaccine for conducting clinical trials. And then, if it gets approval, then the institution who conduct the clinical trial need to develop the full proposals and then submit to the ethics committee for approval. So if 2 steps passed, so the institution could start implementing the clinical trials activities. And they also define that the principal investigator and sponsor as well need to report to MOH quarterly about the safety, about the following the approval procedures from MOH. And they also stated clearly that sponsor will be responsible for any serious adverse event if it happened due to the study for the subject. And now I would like to share some information about the drug restoration in Vietnam so far. And you know, before 2008, the vaccine restoration to be in charge of the preventive medicine department, and they just hand over to the administration of drug or drug administration. So this department is really new with vaccine, with issuing vaccine restoration. So you can imagine how difficulties or how challenges would be for both manufacturer and also for the NRA to issue the restoration. So now it's a little bit slower than before. And the regulation defines the eligibility, the right, the requirement, and responsibility of the manufacturers or distributor who want to register the products. And they also require what kind of documents you need to submit and what kind of form you should use for submission as well. And in the regulation, they also define which kind of license the manufacturers or distributor might get for new products, for the old product already licensed, but after expires, they need to re-register. And they're touching a little bit on intellectual properties and confidentiality of the information the manufacturer or distributor submitted. And they also define the roles of independent review committees composed of the review experts and advisory committee for restoration, drug restoration. And this regulation combine both for drug in general and also some specific articles related to vaccine itself. Here I summarize some key points of the regulation. The manufacturer should get the GMP certificate from Ministry of Health. It's really newly definition, or let's say regulation. Before 2008 or 2007, 2008, the manufacturer not compulsory to submit or to get the certificates of GMP from MOH, but just recently, for vaccine restoration, they need to get GMP certificate from Ministry of Health. But this in the transition period. So some company, they haven't met the GMP, still get their product register. But they give some time for them to be able to update or upgrade their facility to meet the GMP from MOH. And all GMP's indicators, they based on the WHO GMP. And for the vaccine, they should get the quality test certificates from what we call in Vietnam National Institute for Control of Vaccine and Biologicals. For other drugs, they will send to other centers. Or if they are GMP manufacturer, they can just submit their document themselves rather than getting testing results from the national centers. So it also takes about 6 months for MOS to respond to you whether you get a register, your product register or license or not. And if you miss the chance, you may take another year to get the registration. So it's really critical to submit a complete document for MOH. And in general, once vaccine get registration or license, it takes in effect for 5 years. But in some special case, for very new vaccine like a Gardasil, HPV vaccine, for example, they just issue 1 year's certificate, and then you have to renew it after 1 year. Maybe second time they might give 5 years license. And for the dossiers, they just apply the they follow the Association of Southeast Asian countries regulation. So they have the forms, all the description of what you need to submit for approval. Now I would like to just give you some brief information of the vaccine production in Vietnam. So far we have 4 manufacturers, used to be 5, but one institute. Now they stopped producing vaccine, as Dr. Bry already mentioned in his presentation. And all EPI vaccines in Vietnam so far provided by those local companies. So they meet the need of the EPI program in Vietnam. And the capacity of local companies, apart from supplying for the EPI program, they also could be able to export. And the company like Vabiotech and IVAC, they already export some of their products in other countries, like India or Laos. And so far, there are not any vaccine in Vietnam with some WHO pre-qualification. Here we would like to share with you some thoughts about the need of support. As Dr. Bry already mentioned in his presentation on the need of support for manufacturers, I just touching a little bit on the 2 bullet points. First, there is a big need for strengthening the capacity of local institutions in conducting the standard clinical trials. Based on our experience working long time in Vietnam, so far we only can identify 3 institutions having experience with vaccine clinical trials. And it's hard to say they already meet the standard. So I think it takes quite a long time to build the local capacity for being able to conducting the standard clinical trial. And before conducting any clinical trial, we always provided the training for them every time. And now other organizations like Family Health International, they also provided support for building capacity in country for clinical trials. And the last bullet point is to strengthening the capacity of national regulatory authority to exercise the 6 functions described by WHO. And in 2006, there was an assessment of national regulatory authorities, and we already met two requirements from WHO. on licensing, and also on the not release certificate, and the others. There need a lot of support to be able for Ministry of Health to meet the requirement in terms of national regulatory authorities. And from our experience, we see that apparently with supporting for the vaccine production, it's also very important to support for Ministry of Health to have a good strategy in maximize using of vaccine produced in country as well. We had very big lesson learned about some vaccine before. Government invested a lot of money for vaccine companies. As Dr. Rich also mentioned, all vaccine companies in Vietnam is a state-out company. So they invest a lot of money, but then the products produced, and then with getting support from some other resource like Gavi, for Pentahip, for example, all the local products may be stopped with the new funding. So it's important to have a good strategy on local use of vaccines. If after the vaccine produced, for example, flu vaccine, it's important to have a good policy on using a vaccine, because it's not already included in the EPI program. So if no use when you produce, and it's really hard to maintaining the capacity of the manufacturers. So this some of our thought to share with you for the recommendation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. We are kind of out of time because we started late, but I think we can take a couple of questions is what I've been told. So I see 3, so we'll take those 3. Why don't we start with you in the back, behind you. Go ahead.
My question is for Dr. Huong. Can you clarify, Samuel Adeni Jones from HHS, can you clarify for me whether you have 2 levels of ethical review in Vietnam? You sort of gave the impression that there is a review at the National Ministry of Health, but also at the institutional level. So who gets the protocol first to look at it?
So at first, this one. Before submitting to Ministry of Health level, is the highest level, you should submit to the national institution level first. And as I mentioned, only national institution could be able to conduct clinical trials. So that institution need to approve first. And normally they have an ethical committee at that level as well, as some scientific committee. So they approve first, and they should attach that document before submitting to the Ministry of Health. Yeah.
Thank you. I saw 2 other questions. Yeah.
Hi, George Robertson from PATH, and this is for David, and Jesse, you can put your old hat on. This is a regulatory vaccine question. And it has to do with the fact that customarily the current flu vaccines, when there's another strain, it's regarded as a strain change. There's not a requirement for trials. My question is, with the idea about these recombinant proteins, where you're going to make, where there's no history and it's not just a slight variation on a virus that has probably been seen many years before. What is your assessment on, because one of the comments that's made all the time is how quick these recombinant vaccines are going to get out. Do you anticipate that they will have as easy a time for regulation once they've, even after they're initially licensed?
Well, I think that the initial studies obviously have got to be done, and I'm sure that there will be a need for a full regulatory package so that the first submissions, are really The data is there to show that these products are going to behave in the way that they're expected to behave. And I would imagine that what will happen is that, with time, as the experience builds up, and this is just a guess, I would think, to start with, that, we'd want to see that the first strain change, for example, you probably want to have some supporting data to, again, verify that it does what it does. And then, if all goes well and confidence builds, then I would imagine you could tail it off. That is what I would imagine is the type of scenario that we could be looking at for these novel products, and I think that, with novel products, you do need to develop that sort of history of, or some sort of history, to be confident that they are doing what you're expecting them to do.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable paradigm. The other thing to remember is during the clinical development process for example, some of the recombinant products that are under development, they have been studied with multiple strains, so there are different seasons, different strains as part of clinical development. But I think actually, so we would anticipate that it ends up in a very similar way to where things are now. But I think as we've seen, we told everybody at the beginning of H1N1, we tell everybody every season that I think we're still every year learning from influenza and about influenza. So I think, I hadn't really thought too deeply about this, but it will be pretty important to be sure that the recombinant proteins behave similarly to the proteins that are currently used in the standard methodologies for influenza vaccine. But to date, I think once we are familiar with that, we would have confidence. And in fact, the recombinant technology, as is hoped, might lead you to be able to get a strain from isolation, or even not even isolation, availability of the genetic sequence to a vaccine quite quickly. Thank you. And one more question. Yeah.
Okay, I would like to ask Dr. Huong, as I understood from the presentation, that there is a lot of support from the PAF for this success story in Vietnam. But I would like to know if these companies, the 4 companies that are producing vaccines in Vietnam, are they state-owned company or they are private?
All the vaccine companies in Vietnam is a state-owned company, not private company.
Okay, so there is any competition, or they are complementing each other?
Actually, each of them produce different kind of vaccine, but almost no overlapping. Yeah. Okay. So government assigns one company produces this, another company produce another vaccine, so almost no competition in terms of their products.
And concerning the 6 functions of the WHO, you said that you succeeded in 2 functions only up till now. Is it post-marketing surveillance one of them or not? Post-marketing surveillance?
No.
No, not one of them.
That.
Thank you.
But it's assessed in 2006. Now it's, I would say, a lot of improvement have been made due to the WHO support.
I don't see other questions. I would say that tomorrow, I know you have a session with several speakers that will look at some of the opportunities to build strength, such as the work that Dr. Huong and Wood have both talked about. So I think you'll have a good discussion of this tomorrow. And I think an important thing that last question reminded me is that, we really need to think about what are the priorities and sort of what are the more efficient and rational ways to develop them. Not everybody can do everything, yet this particular issue about quality and confidence and safety is going to be something that every country takes very importantly and is going to look to their own regulators and their own trusted people for that opinion, even if they're working and collaborating closely with the global community. So with that, thank you all very much. I think you have a break now. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, thank you.